When we started, we were writing breakdowns for people to beat ass.
Knocked Loose is a band that really kind of shouldn't exist. And what I mean by that is that no band that sounds like this should be anywhere near as popular as Knocked Loose is. At the time of this recording, Knocked Loose is sitting at 2.3 million listeners on Spotify, off the back of their most recent album, which is getting praised by critics and fans pretty much left, right, and center.
So yeah, that's this incredible, badass, thoughtful, boundary-pushing album that I'm really impressed with. I'm feeling a decent 2 strong 9 on this thing.
On top of that, Knocked Loose recently played Coachella and even had Billie Eilish rocking out side stage, and had a semi-viral moment with their song Suffocate featuring Poppy. And you could say a lot of those same things about Turnstile too, although I think at this point they're basically an indie band with some kind of references to hardcore. Well, on the other hand, Knocked Loose is, if anything, heavier and more pissed off than they've ever been, and doing things that I never ever expected a band like that to do. And with that in mind, the question is, how do they do it? How did a band that plays music this vicious and pissed off manage to capture the attention of pretty much the entire metal and hardcore world, and even some people outside of it? Well, a lot of other bands who might actually be more accessible still struggle. Those are the questions I will try to answer in this video. And to understand how Knocked Loose became so successful, first we need to go back to the beginning. Knocked Loose formed in 2013 in Oldham County, Kentucky, initially under the name Manipulator, which they later changed to Knocked Loose. They quickly released a demo in 2013 on Bandcamp, also called Manipulator, which I actually hadn't ever heard until I was researching this video. And considering that it's just a super low budget demo, I actually think it's pretty damn good. Like, I think they could put this song into their set list tomorrow and it would fit right in. But their first notable release was the Pop Culture EP in 2014, which is where I first heard them. I think I saw like a gif of the guy throwing a trash can from this video on Tumblr or something. I looked into it and I was like, damn, this band is pretty sick. And so, as you can hear, Knocked Loose is one of those bands that was just good from day one. Some bands, it takes them a few years to get there, but not Knocked Loose. I would say their newer stuff is certainly better than this, but their demo, and especially that first EP, I think they definitely still hold up. And they did have a bit of buzz back then. This was kind of the tail end of the era where Tumblr girls had Expire beanies, and everybody, including me, had a Zabalba snapback, and I think they kind of caught a little bit of that, but there was nothing there in terms of the popularity they had that would make me think they would hit anywhere near the heights that they would today.
All my friends are so full of shit. They talk a lot, but they'll never fucking get it.
A year later, they also released a split with Damaged Goods, which is a little bit more raw in terms of production, but definitely worth checking out if you're a diehard fan of the band.
Tell the fucking
But Knocked Loose, as we know them today, really began when they signed to Pure Noise Records and released their debut album Laugh Tracks in September of 2016.
I have dreams of dancing with the tide, but my feet won't get the tempo.
And I thought signing to Pure Noise was a really interesting move that kind of says a lot about where the band went and probably where they intended to go even back then. What I mean is that Pure Noise was primarily known for pop punk bands that maybe had a little bit of like a hardcore influence. For example, The Story So Far, State Champs, and Handguns. And so it was very interesting to me that they signed this like super heavy beatdown band, but it also kind of made sense because even though Knocked Loose sounded like that, they were never really culturally aligned with that just like caveman knuckle dragger side of hardcore where guys with chin strap beards beat the shit out of high school kids at shows. Obviously, people dance hard at their shows, but that was just really never the vibe. And so I think Pure Noise made a lot of sense for them culturally, and they had also shown with their track record that they knew how to market a band like Knocked Loose outside of the hardcore scene. And in my opinion, this was a little bit of a rough period for heavy music in general, with metalcore and deathcore at the time pretty much being relegated to like Reddit neckbeard territory. And on the hardcore side of things, I think Turnstile was really kind of the only band making waves around that time. Like Nonstop Feeling came out in 2015, and I would say was probably the biggest thing in hardcore since Keepers of the Faith. But when Laugh Tracks came out, it really immediately took that crown as like the hype thing in hardcore, and I think there's a few reasons for that. For one, it was just this perfect combination of absurdly heavy but also super catchy in a way that really nobody had done before. Like you can certainly hear the roots of what they were doing in bands like Disembodied. But Knocked Loose just did it better in every way. No disrespect to Disembodied, I love them. But a song like Oblivion's Peak is really just like the peak of that style. It could be the soundtrack for crowd killing, but at the same time, it's really catchy in a way that other beatdown bands just never were. Bad production has always classically been a thing that was kind of an issue for a lot of hardcore and beatdown bands, but with Laugh Tracks, it had just absolutely flawless production thanks to Will Putney. Like that perfect balance of raw and nasty, but still like polished and punchy in all the right places. There's also Brian's vocals, which a lot of people don't like, and I admit I sort of had to get used to at first, but I actually think that's a huge part of what makes the band work. And what I mean is that I think this genre generally has deeper vocals kind of along these lines. Which definitely works for some bands, but with Knocked Loose, I think Brian's vocals make them sound just like genuinely enraged and pissed off in a way that to me has a lot more of an emotional connection than all those bands just like trying to put on some kind of tough guy act. And I also think that his vocal range is a big part of what makes people into this that might not normally like this kind of music. Like you look at Brian and you hear his vocals and you don't feel like the singer is some guy with a beard that's gonna like kick the shit out of you if you show up to their show. Which, like I mentioned earlier, I think is kind of true about Knocked Loose in general and really a big part of their appeal. On the one hand, yes, they're heavy as shit and people do dance hard at their shows and that's a big part of the fun. But I think in general, the band themselves and their fans aren't the kind of like thugs and scumbags that would often kind of surround the beatdown bands in the past and make people understandably just kind of avoid them. Which brings me back to what I was saying about Pure Noise. I think Knocked Loose kind of occupied a similar space in their genre as The Story So Far did in pop punk. Sort of occupying that place where they could be an entry point to hardcore, not only with their music, but also with, I guess for lack of a better word, their overall vibe. And of course, we also have to mention that this album brought us one of the best additions to the hardcore lexicon, Arf Arf. And off the back of that record, they continued touring relentlessly as they had for years, doing Warped Tour in 2017, for example. But I think what was really eye-opening for me was in 2018, when they did their first headlining tour with Terror as direct support. And to me, that was crazy to see because Terror was hands down the biggest pure hardcore band of their era. So to see a younger band like Knocked Loose headline over them said a lot. And I remember a lot of people being kind of upset about this, but Terror's vocalist Scott Vogel, I think, had a great take on it. We told some people the tour is happening and they're like, you're gonna play before Knocked Loose? And I'm like, yeah, they're bigger than us. You just have to put all the ego aside and do what's best. And after that, 3 years later, they released the follow-up to Laugh Tracks called A Different Shade of Blue. And to me, this album was basically Laugh Tracks, but just better in every way. Better songs, heavier breakdowns, better production. They had clearly put in the work and it showed. Another thing worth pointing out, I think, is that the kind of unique sound of Brian's vocals became even more pronounced on this album. I personally thought made them sound even more pissed. And they also started adding in some of the elements that have become the trademark of their sound now. Specifically, I think their songs got a little bit more dynamic with those like eerie, clean parts that kind of broke the songs up a little bit and made the heavy parts feel even heavier. And this album got nearly universal praise and actually hit number 26 on Billboard, which was insane to see for any hardcore band of any kind, let alone one this ridiculously heavy. Which brings us to their next release, an EP called A Tear in the Fabric of Life, released in 2021. And if you're not familiar with it, this is a concept EP. As Brian described it, the story follows a main character through a traumatic car crash late one night in the woods that leaves his partner deceased, and from there you spiral with him into the depression and guilt that comes with being the cause of something so detrimental. And they also paired that with an animated film that follows and visualizes the whole EP. They got Magnus Johnson to animate the whole thing, who did work for a bunch of movies like Riders of Justice and The Last King, as well as working for a bunch of big bands like Meshuggah and Under Oath on their videos. And personally, I'm not a big concept album guy, but I do think it's really cool that they did this. It came together extremely well, and I think it shows that, yet again, they were thinking on just sort of another level than pretty much everybody else in hardcore and metalcore. And to me, what's especially cool about it is that they did this without ever getting into that like self-indulgent, noodly kind of prog territory like most bands do as soon as they start talking about concept albums and films and all that kind of stuff. And musically, this is where they took a lot of those dynamic elements from A Different Shade of Blue and really emphasized those and evolved into what I would say is their current sound, where things are both brutally heavy while also just kind of a little bit unsettling, which is something that would become even more pronounced in the future. And really, if you just put it all together, the whole thing just feels brutal. Despite it being a fictional story, you can tell that the feelings behind it are real, because I don't really think that you can just perform moments that sound like this. And the next year didn't see any new releases from Knocked Loose, but Brian did have a feature on a Motionless in White song called Slaughterhouse, which quickly became a favorite among the fan bases of both bands. And after that, in 2023, they had a bit of a viral moment when they somehow managed to play Coachella. And Coachella obviously is one of the biggest musical events in the world, really one of the biggest pop culture events in general, headlined by just the biggest mainstream pop artists. For example, last year's headliners, I think, were Bad Bunny, Blackpink, and Frank Ocean. And so to bring music this heavy to the Coachella audience is really just a massive win for both hardcore and heavy music in general. And on top of that, like I mentioned earlier, Billie Eilish was side stage vibing for them during their set. Huge, huge moment for them. And for anybody who thinks Billie Eilish somehow ended up there by accident, she didn't. She really does like this stuff, and she does have connections to the scene. For example, her ex-boyfriend is Jesse Rutherford of The Neighborhood, who is also a longtime San Fernando Valley hardcore kid. And this was understandably a pretty big deal for the band, and capitalizing on this momentum, they released 2 new singles a month after Coachella. And I think a lot of people, including me, kind of expected them to maybe go softer after all this mainstream attention, maybe to add in some clean vocals or maybe scale back the breakdowns. But as most of you know, what happened is the exact opposite of that.
Close, motherfucker!
And coming off of that, they released a few singles that would end up being their next album. And the hype for this thing was tremendous. In particular, reaching a bit of a ridiculous level with the song Suffocate featuring Poppy.
I will take it till I find a fucking love!
And for some context here, if you're not aware, this single in particular actually ended up charting higher on the Spotify viral charts than Taylor Swift. Obviously, that doesn't mean they're bigger than Taylor Swift, but my point is that if you're outdoing literally the biggest star on the planet for like even 1 minute, then you are definitely doing something right. And that is an absolutely unbelievable accomplishment, especially for like a brutal beatdown hardcore band like Knocked Loose. And all of this culminated in the release of their most recent album, You Won't Go Before You're Supposed to. And this is one of those extremely rare times where expectations are super high, and yet somehow it manages to meet or even exceed all of them. Fans are pretty much in agreement that this is their best stuff to date. Critics are praising it as both just a fantastic album, as well as a thoughtful, boundary-pushing piece of art, while also being commercially successful.
Being real, I'm a New England boy. I've heard my fair share of metalcore over the years, and I truly believe this record here is honestly pushing the envelope for the genre a little bit, which is pretty surprising because I didn't think anything was ever really going to top something like a Kurt Ballou production.
And I think musically, it's just pretty hard to argue anything other than this being the absolute best work they have done. They've been putting in the work for 10 years now, and it absolutely shows. But I also want to give a shout out to Drew Folk's work here as producer, which I think made a big difference. Just about everything he touches turns to gold, whether that's Motionless in White, Kim Dracula, Wage War. The dude is brilliant, and this album is no exception. It's just as heavy as ever, if not maybe even more, but it's also catchier than ever, and with this new kind of unsettling, weird factor sort of lurking below the surface, which I think is really interesting. They refined this aspect of their sound to the point where the whole album almost feels like it could be like the soundtrack to a horror movie. Maybe it's a new genre called A24 core. I don't know.
I dream of a cleansing wave, reborn, don't reach for me, no lies can spread from a tongue removed. And I love the way these lyrics expand even further over these doomy and eerie, heavier guitar passages later into the track.
Overall, this is an absolutely massive achievement for the band, but just for hardcore in general, I think we're going to look back at this and remember it as one of the most important heavy music albums of the 2020s, and I can't wait to see what they do next. Which brings us to the last question of this video. Why them? Why, of all the newer bands, did they manage to break out the way that they did, while other bands who are nowhere near as heavy as they are still struggling to kind of get any attention at all? Honestly, I'm still kind of shocked, but I think there are a few factors as to why. For one, I think we just have to point out the sheer quality of their music. It kind of speaks for itself, but I think that's fairly obvious and probably the least interesting factor that goes into this. I think a much more important and interesting factor is that they are one of the only hardcore bands in years who's managed to get the attention of younger people. Like, if you go to one of their shows, you'll see a lot of teenagers, plenty of people in their early 20s, both men and women, which hasn't really happened to a hardcore band in quite a while other than Turnstile, which, like I said earlier, sonically, they really haven't played hardcore in years. And the reason why that is important should be pretty obvious, which is that a band being fawned over by bearded dudes on Reddit really just doesn't make you successful. And the final thing that needs to be mentioned is that I think they really came out at exactly the right time. Like, the default flavor of modern metal has been this sort of like very polished, highly refined, genty thing for quite a while now. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of people, including me, are just kind of sick of it at this point. And them coming out with this like creepy, almost like horror-infused version of metalcore and hardcore was a breath of fresh air that honestly we've needed for a while. I think people are just very tired of that super perfect, highly polished thing. And I think that's also why we've seen other hardcore bands like Drain, Gulch, and Tsunami, and to a lesser extent, even bands like Body Box and Peeling Flesh, get way bigger than anybody could have really imagined. And with all of that being said, I have no idea what their next move is going to be. Honestly, I thought that as soon as they reached 1 million listeners on Spotify, that's as big as they ever could have possibly gotten. But obviously, I was wrong about that, so I don't know. All I know for sure is that they still have a very bright future ahead of them, and I can't wait to see what they're going to do next. Alright, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments, and also I would like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my videos early. I also do giveaways and Q&As sometimes, and there's also a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video, and with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.